Naresh Fernandes. Are we ready for the session? Couple of minutes just in case.
Well, welcome. Can you hear me? No.
No.
It's like a noose.
Yeah.
All right.
Is it okay? Can you hear me?
Hello. No, still
No,
not.
this is not working. This one is not working.
I think we have to try. Oh, we can follow this.
Yes.
All right. We have a second.
Yours is okay?
I think mine's okay.
Okay.
She's fine.
Well, Jung Chang, welcome to Jaipur. It's a real pleasure to have you here. In a dress that is made in the same period as the character you write about.
It is, yes, yes. So I thought I perhaps should wear something of her period, so you can get a sort of visual idea of what people look like. Well, not really, but yes.
And so looking as regal as ever, you have a presentation to make.
Yes.
So let's listen to it.
Now, yeah, okay. Right, all right. I think perhaps before I turn to the Empress Dowager, I should say a few words about how I myself became a writer. And I was born in China, and when I was a child, I always wanted to write. I loved writing. But I was growing up under Mao in the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s. And then it was impossible even to have this dream, because under Mao's tyranny, nearly all writers were persecuted, sent to the gulag, being driven to suicide, some were even executed. And even writing for oneself was dangerous. I remember I wrote my first poem on my 16th birthday in 1968. I was lying in bed polishing my poem when I heard the door banging. My father's persecutors had come to raid our flat, and if they saw my poem, I would get into trouble and my family would get into trouble. So I had to quickly rush to the bathroom to tear up the poem and flush it down the toilet. So that ended my first literary venture. But the desire to write never left me. In the following years, I was exiled to the edge of the Himalayas and worked as a peasant and as a barefoot doctor. A barefoot doctor was a peasant doctor without any training, because Mao said the more books you read, the more stupid you become. So I became a doctor without training. And then later I became a steel worker and an electrician. Again, there was no formal training, and I had 5 electric shocks in 1 month. But when I was spreading manure in the paddy fields, and when I was checking electricity supplies on top of the electricity poles, I was always writing in my head with an invisible pen. But I just couldn't put pen to paper. And then in 1976, Mao died, and things began to change. And in 1978, for the first time under the communists, scholarships for going abroad were awarded on academic basis. I sat for a national exam, I did reasonably well, so I became one of the first group of 14 people to go and study in Britain. As far as I was concerned, I was the first person to get out of Sichuan province, a province then of 90 million people, to go and study in the West. And I was so lucky because when I got my doctorate in linguistics from the University of York in England in 1982, because I was so lucky, I became the first person from communist China ever to get a doctorate from a British university. And when I arrived in London in 1978, then I could write, and I could write whatever I wanted to write. But it was at that moment the desire to write left me. Because I had come to a entirely different world. It was like landing on Mars. And everything was new. I just wanted to spend every minute soaking up the new world. And when we first arrived in Britain, we were all wearing the Mao suit, the blue kind of uniform. And we were not allowed to go out on our own, so we had to move in a group. And we were quite a sight in the London streets. And also, we were under many rules. We were not allowed to, we were told not to do this and that and the other. And one particular thing we were told not to do was to go to an English pub, because the Chinese translation for pub, 酒吧, in those days suggested somewhere indecent with nude women gyrating. So we were told not to go to a pub. But of course, I was torn with curiosity. I spotted the pub across the road from the college. And one day I sneaked out of the college, I darted across the road, and I pushed the door of the pub open. Of course, I saw nothing of the kind. Only some men sitting there drinking beer. I was rather disappointed. Of course. And then, before I arrived in England in 1978, the only foreigners I met were some sailors in a port in South China, where we, as English language students, were sent to practice our English with. China was completely closed to the outside world. And we would be sitting in the only restaurant for them, and we eagerly awaiting our sailors, and we would grab them as soon as they came on shore. And of course, we had no idea what must be on their minds. And even our English language teachers had not seen foreigners themselves. So our textbooks were direct translations of Chinese texts. In those days in China, when we bumped into each other, we would say, 吃饭了吗?上哪去? Which means, where are you going? And have you eaten? So those were the English greetings I learned. So when I first arrived in London, I used to go around and ask people where they were going, whether they had eaten. And so, as you can imagine, life was exciting as China was becoming more and more open, and I was breaking more and more rules, and I was having a more and more exciting time. And the last thing I want is to look back and look inward and to write. Because to write for me would inevitably involve that process. And in the Cultural Revolution, which I had left behind, my father died, and my beloved grandmother died. My father was one of the few who stood up to Mao and protested the Cultural Revolution. So as a result, he was arrested, tortured, driven insane, and sent to a camp and died tragically and prematurely. My mother was under tremendous pressure to denounce my father. She refused. So as a result, she was put through over 100 of those ghastly denunciation meetings, which were an everyday feature in the Cultural Revolution. So basically, the victims would be stood on the stage, their arms were ferociously pushed to the back, and their heads were ferociously put down, and they were kicked and beaten. My mother was made to kneel on broken glass, And she was exiled to a camp, but she survived. And today she still lives in Chengdu in China. And these were very painful things for me to think about. So I just wanted to forget all about China and enjoy my new life. And then in 1988, my mother came to London to stay with me. For the first time, she told me the stories of her life and stories of my grandmother and her relationship with my father. And once my mother started, she couldn't stop. She stayed with me for 6 months, and we talked every day. And by the time she left London, she had left me 60 hours of tape recordings. And that's how I started writing Wild Swans. Because I was listening to, when I was listening to my mother, I suddenly realized, I thought, you know, I've got to write all this down. And then I realized how much I wanted to be a writer and how much I had always wanted to be a writer. And and now, you know, I could be a writer. So I wrote Wild Swans. And then when the book was published in the early 1990s, I was thinking about another book. Mao Zedong, the Chinese tyrant, seemed to be the obvious subject because he dominated my early life, and I saw him turning the lives of a quarter of the world's population upside down. And yet I felt the world knew astonishingly little about him. And I myself had many unanswered questions. When I was writing Wild Swans, there were a lot of questions. So I thought I should write a biography. That's the best way to get to know him. My husband, Jung, who's half English, half Irish, was also interested in Mao. So we embarked on this project together. We divided our research by language. Because I'm Chinese, so I dealt with the Chinese language sources. And Jung, unfortunately, speaks many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. And in particular, he knows Russian and loved working in the Russian archives, which turned out to be a treasure trove. So we spent 12 years traveling the world, pursuing information about Mao. We came to India. We went to Dharamsala and interviewed the Dalai Lama. And we interviewed many people around Nehru. You know, in the 50s, Nehru had a very special relationship with Mao and Zhou Enlai and so on. And so Mao was published in 2005. And I was, then I decided to write about Empress Dowager Cixi. Here she is. She was born in 1835. And that's Beijing at her time, you know, with city wars and the camels coming into the city every day. And when she was 16 years old, she went through one of those periodic nationwide selections for imperial consorts. Like hundreds of girls from all over China, she was paraded in front of the emperor. She caught the eye of the emperor, and she was installed as one of his many concubines. A Chinese emperor was entitled to one empress and as many concubines as he liked. And this is Cixi playing chess in the Forbidden City with a eunuch. And this is her husband, Emperor Xianfeng. Now, in 1860, Emperor Xianfeng was forced to flee Beijing with the court to the north beyond the Great War. And the reason was that the British invaded. Britain wanted to have more trade with China, but Emperor Xianfeng, like his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, stubbornly and toughly resisted the British effort. So a British expedition led by Lord Elgin, you know, the son of the Elgin marble, repute or disrepute, then invaded Beijing, and he burned down the old summer palace. You might have seen the new summer palace in Beijing and may, you know, loved its splendor, but that was only one small part in this gigantic compound of palaces. So Emperor Xianfeng was heartbroken, and he refused to return to Beijing, and he died in self-imposed exile in 1861 in the northern wilderness. He had only one son, a son with Cixi, and that son was made the next emperor. Oh, of course, this is not their son. And in fact, this is one of the ancestors of the Pekingese dog outside China. And the thing is that when Lord Elgin went into the old summer palace, his troops found the body of an elderly imperial consort who had died, who had not managed to flee with the court, and who had died of fright. And around her body were 5 Pekingese dogs. So the British brought them back and started to breed them. This particular one was named Luti and was presented to Queen Victoria as a present. And Queen Victoria had this picture painted of Luti. And this boy in blue was their son. He was then 5 years old. And Emperor Xianfeng appointed 8 powerful princes and grandees to be the co-regents for him. At this point, Cixi then launched a palace coup and ousted these 8 powerful regents and made herself the real power behind the throne. She did this with the Empress. And you know, remember, Cixi was a concubine and a low-rank concubine. Because she had a son, her rank grew, but the Empress was the #1. And you know, I was actually surprised during my research, because our idea of the harem was always a place of backbiting, you know, women fighting to have their husbands' favors, stabbing each other on the back, but not at all over there. And these 2 women actually became best friends and comrades, and together they launched the coup, and facing the prospect of death by 1,000 cuts, which was a prescribed punishment for treason in those years, you know, literally slowly slicing somebody to death. And it so happened they succeeded. And out of the 8 regents, they executed 3. The chief of the 8 regents was beheaded, and the 2 others were each sent a long white silk scarf to hang themselves with. And this was called the Cibo. It was considered an imperial favor. And so this was Cixi being carried to the morning audience. But the coup was a popular one, because Cixi asked a very simple but intelligent question, which was, why must we resist opening the door to the West? Why can't we open the door and do business with the West and benefit China itself? And this simple question changed China, and China's door was opened from 1861. Now, okay, this is where the 2 women conducted their morning audiences. They would not be seated on the throne. The boy emperor would be put on the throne from time to time, and the women would be seated behind the throne and behind the curtain of the throne, because in those years, women were not allowed to be face to face with their with men, and all the officials were male. And this is the splendid front part of the Forbidden City. And Cixi, as the de facto supreme leader of China for nearly half a century, on and off, but mainly on, never set foot in this front part, because women were not allowed to set foot in the front part of the Forbidden City. And the women were confined to the harem at the back. And Cixi hated it, and she said it was just walls and the gates. But they began to change China, and And Cixi, for example, employed this man on the right, who is Ulster man, Robert Hart, to take charge of the Chinese customs. And Robert Hart served China for as long as Cixi lived. And he made a great contribution to Chinese economy, contributing as much as 1/3 of China's national income. Here he is, with his orchestra, Western orchestra of Western instruments of Chinese musicians. And the man standing in the middle was Cixi's first ambassador to the West. He was called Anson Burlingame. He was President Lincoln's first ambassador, minister then called, to China. And when his term ended, Cixi appointed him China's ambassador to the West. So he traveled to Western countries, America and Europe, for 2 years, and promoting the new China, as he called it. And his two Chinese deputies on both sides of him, and further on, the two secretaries of the delegation, one British, one English, one French. Okay, now Cixi then started a wealth of reforms. Whatever modernity meant in the 19th century, and China then was a medieval society, bear in mind. And the signs of modernity, like electricity, the railway, steamboats, telegrams, a modern army and navy, a national flag, an educational system that teaches science. All these things were introduced into China by Cixi. And for me, very importantly, she banned foot binding and espoused women's liberation in China. Now, this is how I got interested in her. When I was writing Wild Swans, my grandmother, my grandmother had bound feet. And until then, I didn't know, who exactly banned foot binding vaguely. I thought perhaps the communists or something. That was the kind of education I grew up in. But then I realized actually foot binding was first outlawed by Empress Dowager Cixi. Oh, sorry, by the way, okay, anyway, let's get on to this one. Now, my grandmother was my size, but her feet were like this. You see, foot binding was not just to put a piece of cloth around the feet. Only the big toe was allowed to grow, and the other 4 toes and the arch were crushed under a big stone. And the binding was there to stop the broken bones from recovering. So Chinese women were tortured by this ghastly tradition for 1,000 years. And this was banned by Cixi, outlawed by Cixi. And then then this was more than 20 years ago now, and I thought this was so different from the image of Cixi that was in my mind. And you know, Cixi has always been said, it still is, to be a die-hard conservative, a cruel despot who dragged China behind, and who was the root of the problems with China. And all this was, how do we square that with banning foot binding and, you know, espousing women's liberation? So I had this question, but I didn't do anything about it because I was writing Wild Swans. And then when I was writing the biography of Mao, I was astonished by the kind of freedom Mao enjoyed when he was growing up under the Empress Dowager and in the years of her legacy just after she died. Mao was born in 1893. He was a peasant lad, but he had many opportunities to get scholarships and to go abroad if he wanted to. It so happened he didn't want. And Mao could travel the country with girlfriends and, you know, check into hotels as husband and wife. And he could write for newspapers. And by the way, Cixi also introduced the brand new free press. The press under her was freer than what it is today. And Mao was writing for this free press. And all these opportunities and freedom I couldn't dream of when I was growing up under Mao. And so all this made me very interested in her. And this picture is this boys being sent to America to receive comprehensive education in 1870. But you see, Cixi's reforms were carried out in this start, stop way. And the reason was that as a woman, she was not entitled to rule. She could only rule when the emperor was a child, and she ruled from behind the screen. Once the emperor grew up, she had to retire back to the harem. So Cixi's son came of age at 16, and Cixi retired. But the 16-year-old was not interested in reforms, so he shelved the reforms that Cixi had started. And he was not interested in running the empire. He was most interested, you know, like a lot of other 16-year-olds, in sex. And in particular, he loved sneaking out of the Forbidden City to frequent male as well as female prostitutes. But he died having ruled for less than 2 years. So Cixi promptly seized the opportunity and put another 3-year-old on the throne. She adopted this 3-year-old from her sister and made him the next emperor, Emperor Guangxu. And this is Emperor Guangxu. Emperor Guangxu grew up in the Forbidden City, and he was not interested as a child, he was not interested even in sneaking out of this Forbidden City. And he had many phobia. For example, he was dreadfully afraid of thunders. So whenever there was a thunderstorm, eunuchs would gather and shout at the top of their voice to try to drown out the thunders. And she was contented to stay in the Forbidden City, imbibing the Confucian classics. And this was probably partly because he grew very attached to his classics tutor, Grand Tutor Wang, because Cixi, let's face it, was not a good stepmother. She thought that she was indifferent to Emperor Guangxu and didn't give him the kind of love which she actually had given to her own son. And so Emperor Guangxu grew up estranged from Cixi, but attached to this elderly man who hated the West and who then persuaded the emperor to shelve all Cixi's reform projects. And then at this point, Japan seized the opportunity and attacked China in 1894. And in this war, there was a fought with ironclads and modern weapons. On China's side, the war was conducted by this 20-year-old something. By then Cixi had retired. When Emperor Guangxu came of age, Cixi had retired back to the harem. So Emperor Guangxu was ruling. He didn't want to ask advice from Cixi because he wanted to have nothing to do with her. So the war was conducted by him, who had rarely stepped out of the Forbidden City, and with his classics tutor as his #1 advisor. But on the side of Japan, there were first-class statesmen. So the outcome of the war was too obvious. China suffered a spectacular defeat and had to pay Japan astronomical sums, and as well as giving Japan Taiwan. Now, at this point, Western powers now changed. Until then, they had some respect for China. And then they suddenly saw that this giant country was a paper tiger. You couldn't put up a decent fight. So they all came and wanted a slice of China. The Germans came first and wanted a place around the port of Qingdao in Shandong province. You may have been to a Chinese restaurant and had the Qingdao beer. That's because it was first made by the Germans. And then the Russians came and wanted a bit of China. The British came again and wanted a bit of China. The French came and got a bit of China. I say a bit of China, but they were all strategic posts on China's coast. And so these foreign occupations gave rise to the xenophobia that was already in this very traditional society. And in particular, rose the Boxer Rebellion. And these were the Boxers. I don't know, some of you might have seen the film 55 Days in Peking. And that was about the Boxers in 1900 surrounding the foreign legations. Now, Cixi's position was actually to put down the Boxers, because the Boxers were very violent, and they particularly targeted the missionaries and the Chinese Christians. But you mustn't think that the Boxers were all over China. They were actually only in Shandong, in the areas near German occupation, because the Germans were particularly harsh in their control of their area. And later on, they developed into Beijing. Now, foreign powers then threatened invasion. And Cixi didn't want their invasion. But then she thought, what did she have? She had no army, no navy. They'd been destroyed by the Japanese. So she then, at that point, made a fatal decision, which she regretted very much later on. And she thought the Boxers could make brave soldiers. And so, but as you can see, so Cixi wanted to use the Boxers as soldiers to fight foreign invasion. And as you can see, the Boxers were armed with sticks and knives. They were no match for the Allied forces of 8 powers. And so Cixi was driven out of the Forbidden City, and this is the Allied forces entering the Forbidden City. During her exile, Cixi repented. She thought that she had made a mistake. She made decrees like 自责之诏, the decree to reproach myself. She apologized to the Christians, Chinese Christians, and Christian missionaries, and she made peace with the West. And so she returned to Beijing at the beginning of 1902. And this was a rare picture snatched by a foreign photographer from the city wall of Beijing, of Cixi getting out of a sedan chair and about to enter a hall. And Cixi, while the photographer was snapping the photograph, Cixi turned around and waved at these foreigners. And this was a departure from tradition, because traditionally Chinese monarchs were not allowed to be seen by their subjects. And when the emperor went out, huge screens would be erected to shield them from the public eye. But Cixi had sent many envoys abroad, and they had reported that in the West, the monarchs wave at their subjects. So this was her first wave. And the railways. Now, this picture, together with other Cixi's pictures, was taken in 1903. And when the photographer saw the pictures, the prints, he knew that the Empress Dowager would not be happy, because she looked her age, which was nearly 70. And so he touched up the prints. The wrinkles were erased, bags under the eyes disappeared. And when they arrived at the Forbidden City, Cixi was thrilled because this isn't what her mirror had been telling her for years. So she had the prints enlarged to giant sizes and hung them all over the Forbidden City. She had some framed and given to foreign heads of state as presents. This particular one was given to the American president to thank him for his congratulations on her 70th birthday. And when the picture arrived in Washington, American press said Cixi looked 40, not 70. And even today, there are Chinese studying the tricks of Cixi to keep her looks. Books have been written. In fact, it's quite simple. It's Photoshop. And so many reforms were carried out, but the place where least reforms were carried out was the court. And Cixi stuck to rigid court etiquette. Everybody must kneel in front of her, and with her permission, they could stand up. And because of this, this rule, and she suffered, she had to give up one of her curiosities. She was a woman with an intense sense of curiosity. She rode a tricycle. She wanted to get into a hot air balloon, but she never rode in a car. There was an insurmountable problem. The driver could not drive kneeling down. He could not even drive standing up. He had to sit right in front of the Empress Dowager. So Cixi never got into a very grand car she was given as a present. But of course, she knew, the reason why she was so rigid about court etiquette was that she thought that the court, the throne, might very well wobble or even collapse if there wasn't these rigid etiquette. Cixi's throne was a Manchu throne. The Manchus were a tiny minority of the Chinese, about 1% of the Chinese population. They had conquered China from the northeast in the 17th century. And now with all the reforms, people going abroad, new education, modern press, I mean the Han Chinese, which are over 90% of the Chinese population, were saying, now we want a majority rule, down with the Manchus. We don't want a Manchu throne, and so on. And so Cixi then was hanging on to this Manchu throne. But she also knew that the throne could not be kept there just by etiquette. So in 1905, she started the last reform of her life, which was to turn China from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy based on the British model, and to have an elected parliament. So her plan was 9 years of preparation as of 1908 would pave the way for the election, which would happen 9 years from 1908. But of course, then she died in 1908, and this reform came to nothing. Now, a little about her personal life. Cixi was surrounded by eunuchs. In the palaces, there was one, the men were the emperor and the eunuchs. Of course, I'll spare you of the details which had turned these men into eunuchs. But she was surrounded by, as you can see, young, good-looking, strong, and so on. And when she was in her late 20s and early 30s, she fell in love with a good-looking eunuch. And to please him, to give him a good time, and Cixi sent him out of the Forbidden City and out of Beijing and down the Great Canal to the southern beauty spot, Suzhou, where, which was famed for gardens and the silks. And this was the route, the journey Cixi herself wanted to make, but she couldn't. And so she sent the eunuch. So the eunuch could celebrate his birthday on the Great Canal with the moon, with music. But this was the early days of her reforms in 1869, and it enraged all these grandees, male grandees. So they had the eunuch and his entourage captured, and the male eunuchs all decapitated. The women musicians were sent to the frontiers to be the slaves of the troops guarding the frontier. And Cixi's lover was not only beheaded, but his corpse was exposed in public for days. So the public could see, he had no male organ. And because there was already a rumor or word that he was having an affair with the Empress Dowager. And Cixi suffered a nervous breakdown, which lasted for many months. And from then on, there was no record of, her emotional life. And I think perhaps her heart was closed because the cost was too high. Now, this was Cixi's funeral. The day before she died, Cixi poisoned her adopted son, Emperor Guangxu. And from her point of view, if she had died and the emperor was still alive, China would fall in the hands of Japan, because Japan had the ambition to dominate China, which was Japan's goal in the Second World War, but the ambition had gone back to the 19th century, and the Emperor Guangxu had been prepared to go along with Japan. So with this act, the next day, Cixi died in 1908. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thanks for that fascinating